things about the changes that were happening in modern war. But, when push came to shove, when he was faced with a true industrial modern war, he was unable to perform well. Not entirely his fault, if you remember all the different issues that the KUK was facing prior to the genesis of the war. But again, his leadership in that conflict was not what it could have been. And he ends up being a main reason not only why the war begins, but why it ends so poorly for the empire. But again, for decades, he's looked at purely as this brilliant reformer and writer, again, by the Austrians and the Germans. And this has a lot to do with kind of that post-World War I feeling that was rampant in both in Austria and in Germany. This kind of, this nationalistic sentiment that the two had after the war, saying, well, we didn't really lose the war. You had the stab in the back myth in Germany. Austria has something to that extent. They kind of praise the leaders who served the nation during World War I. And so it's going to be a kind of a blind patriotism why they support Conrad post-World War I. But in the 60s, there's going to be a better kind of historical review of his performance, both prior to and during World War I. And since then, he's been viewed more as this complex character in military history. He was both a book-smart, kind of a genius when it came to, the technicalities of combat and war. But when it came into, application, he was pretty foolhardy. He had a certain arrogance about him, something that made him disliked by the imperial government, the civil government, his allies in Germany. He was widely, disliked, and it had to do a lot with his personal kind of the way he held himself in relationships after the death of his wife. He was never able to recover from that, and he ends up being this kind of reclusive figure for the rest of his life, and it's going to directly impact how the war is carried out, how he ends up leading the nation in its final war. And so, to kind of wrap up, I don't want you to think of this guy I don't want you to think of him either as a genius or a fool. I think you need to view him as a very complex individual. Any kind of writings that I see, kind of contemporary views of this guy, it's always one or the other. They usually talk about how terrible he was as a leader during World War I, which is correct, or they talk about how he was this military genius and great reformer prior to the war, which is also correct. And so I think the one thing that we can really learn from Conrad as a more of a general rule is that this was a guy who was a very smart individual who could have had a real effective change in the KUK, and he could have done great things for the Austro-Hungarian military, but he allowed his personal life and his personal tragedies to get the better of him. It caused his relationships to kind of disintegrate. It affected how he ended up leading. It affected him in such a way that he was not willing to admit, and it ends up causing one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. So if you're going to take away anything from this, I think that's what you should take away. This guy wasn't a foolish man in general. He made some foolhardy mistakes. He let himself, he allowed himself to lose himself due to the passing of his wife. And he never really came back from that, and he allowed that to really affect the way he led the KUK. It allowed him to, or he allowed himself to become, his judgment to become clouded. He really just did not address his personal issues in a way that would have allowed him to recover from the loss of his wife. And again, it ends up causing, the deaths of, countless men. And yeah, it's really, it's more of a tragic story more than anything. But I think, if anything, this is absolutely a great tale of what I would consider general misconduct. A guy who is, at the top of his game, and even when you've reached the top, you're the most powerful man in the country. You've made it all the way through the ranks. You've done everything that you could possibly accomplish, and yet you still allow those personal life issues to impact your decision making, cause you to make fatal decisions that result in tragic losses of life, in great defeats. And so I think this is more of a story of a imperfect man more than anything else. So I hate to end it on a bummer like that, but that's really how his life ends. It's not as glorious as MacArthur, but not everybody is. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned a lot about Conrad, and maybe you have a better understanding of kind of what went wrong on the Eastern Front for the Austro-Hungarians during World War I. And so I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope to have a new series out next month. It's going to be on Confederate Civil War General Braxton Bragg. And if you know anything about him, it's going to be a lot more talking about defeats than it is victories. So I hope you tune into that. If you have not already, go ahead and check out my Patreon as well. I'm going to be putting up bonus content there. All my Q&A episodes will be posted there in the future, as well as the one for this episode. So if you want to drop a question for that, you can go ahead and subscribe. It's like $1 a month, and you'll get access to all that kind of stuff. There are other options, too, if you want to help support the show. But if you don't, I thank you for listening and downloading. It really helps. Helps me to continue doing the show. I appreciate all your support, and I will see you next time.